sexuality in a long-term relationship. What can a couple do to have a healthy, thriving sexuality, sex life in a long-term relationship?
That is the question.
Yeah.
That is the question.
I mean, the reason it's a problem is because it's pretty easy to have sex with a stranger because you're just running off your biological drive, and you're not trying to be intimate. You're not trying to manage all the other roles. So that's the first thing. So I think the first thing we would say is that it's an art to be cultivated. And it's not a question really of bodies. It's because your body knows how to make sex. It's a question of how
it's your mind who needs to learn.
It's your mind and your emotions.
The emotions.
And how you deal with relationship and intimacy. And how we often say it's not sex itself that's the problem, it's the negotiation around sex. That's where so many couples go wrong with each other.
So what do you mean when you say negotiations? Is it like, can we do it Thursday or Friday or?
We might come back to that because it speaks to something that changes when you're in a long-term relationship, that the expectation that it would be the same as when you were younger and the same spontaneous kind of driving you crazy, like what Nick's saying about going on to biology, will not be there in the same way. And if people have the expectation that it will be like that, the sense of missing out or something being wrong could set in. And then you could fall for the things that probably most of us are getting these days. We are definitely getting a lot of, like the Viagra and keep a woman happy for 20 hours and stuff, as a way of dealing with sexuality in a long-term relationship, which is not going to deal with the underlying issues. When we talk about keeping sexual relationship in a long-term relationship, we're talking about keeping sexual intimacy going. Yeah. And so how to, like, what stops the sexual intimacy is really the issue to look at. What stops it from being there? And that's when we talk about the emotional and the mental issues that come up for it.
And this is when one, or maybe both, lose the interest in sex?
Well...
Or this is when one, or maybe both, lose the interest in sex?
Well...
Or what happens when...
It's more likely that what happens in couples is that they start to create a memory bank of bad experiences, and that they become shy of each other. Because one of the things I think you have to learn as you grow older is you have to learn to ask for what you want. You have to learn to follow your desire with words. And mostly in our culture, we haven't been taught how to ask appropriately for what we want. So we either feel that we have to get it without asking, or that we should be gratified without having to ask, that the other should guess my needs. And that's one of the first things that falls apart in a long-term relationship. And although it's painful, in a way it's a good thing, because you have to learn a more mature stance. You have to learn to be free with the asking. And that brings up the second thing, is that what happens to a person when he gets rejected. And what we found very common in our own lives and in other people's lives is that if you get rejected, there's a tendency for you to become, and this is particularly for the guys, become more like a child than an adult. And to then either have a rather sulky or sometimes angry response, making the other the problem. And that this leads very fast into what we call a bonding pattern, where you have a woman, if we leave that typical case, the woman has said no, and the man goes into his rejected place, which is a very immature place.
And not very sexy.
Yeah, so the woman is in bed with a rejected little boy. And most women don't find that too sexy.
No, I wonder why.
And then there's a way couples don't know how to go back from that. They just escalate and they build on it, And so in the end, the person who's rejected says, well, I won't bother asking next time because I'm liable to be rejected. And that really is where you store the bad memory back.
And it's because, like the bonding patterns we're talking about, they're driven by the power, vulnerability, play within a relationship. And when we talk about intimacy, and specifically around sexual intimacy, it's exactly the issues around power and vulnerability that comes into play. A sexual adult act is a powerful expression of oneself, of an exchange with your partner. Yet it's an exchange that is demanding you to also be voluntarily vulnerable in order to have an exchange and not just doing one thing to the other. So we immediately, when you enter the issue of sexuality and sexual intimacy, you have that is why the bonding patterns often set in, because it becomes who's going to be vulnerable before, who's going to be the powerful one, who's going to be the vulnerable one. And when we get the power and vulnerability in, who's going to be the child, who's going to be the parent. And then